Simon Says subscribe and click on the bell icon to receive notifications.
Hello everyone and welcome to this month's webinar on Excel charts formatting, hacks, tips, tricks, all of that good stuff. So for anybody who is new to our webinars, I'll just briefly introduce myself. So my name's Deborah Ashby. I'm a Microsoft instructor and subject matter expert, and I've been using and training Microsoft products for just over 20 years now, and I'm going to be your host for today. Now, before we get into the lesson, just a little bit of housekeeping. I always like to answer some questions which are asked every single session. So the chat panel is open for everyone. So if you want to chat and post comments throughout the webinar, then please feel free. Just bear in mind that if you have any questions, whilst I'm sharing my screen, I can't actually see the chat panel. So what I generally do is I leave some time at the end. If you have a question as we're going through, just jot it down and we can just go through it at the end of the session. So I'll leave about 5 minutes or so at the end. Also, another question I get all the time is this webinar being recorded? Yes, it is. I've remembered to click the record button today. So you can rewatch this in your own time at a later date, and you can use the practice file that I've just sent through to you. You should receive a link to this webinar once it's been uploaded to the Simon Says It website, and I think it's sent out in the monthly newsletter. So you'll get a link to it. It's also available on the Simon Says It website. You've got the file. I think that's all we need to do. We can pretty much dive in to what we're going to be covering today. Now, briefly, just a little bit of a charts overview. We're really going to focus on just charts and charting skills today. And really, I'm going to show you some tips and tricks when it comes to creating engaging visualizations of data. And hopefully, I'm going to show you some useful things that you didn't know previously. Because charts really are an important part of Excel, particularly these days as analyzing and visualizing data becomes a more and more sought after skill. Everybody's creating dashboards, charts, visualizations. It's very popular at the moment. And we're going to start with a very important and often overlooked topic, which is choosing the correct chart for your data, because not all charts are created equally and not all charts are suitable for every type of data set. So before we get too far into that, let's just take a look at the other things that we're going to cover. As I said, we're going to start out with choosing the right chart. I'm going to speak very briefly about the difference between Excel charts and pivot charts in case you have any confusion with regards to those two. And then we're basically going to dive in and start creating some charts. And I'm going to show you some formatting tips and tricks that hopefully you are maybe unfamiliar with or have never used before. So we're going to start out with everybody's favorite, a clustered column chart. I'm going to show you some formatting that you can do to make it look really cool. I'm going to introduce you to something called Power Toys in Excel. This is going to help you when it comes to if you have specific colors that you want to use in your charts. I'll speak more about that when we get to it. We're going to do things like add slicers. I'm going to show you how to customize them again so they really look and feel part of your chart. We're going to talk about line charts. Again, I'm going to show you some formatting tips and tricks. We're going to take a look at how we can apply custom formatting to the chart axes and how we can basically overlay two charts together to give a completely different type of chart. We're then going to move on to a stacked column chart. And this is really cool because I'm going to show you how you can build a conditional stacked column chart that basically changes color depending on what's going on elsewhere in the spreadsheet. And also how you can add a moving target line, which updates again if values change in the spreadsheet. And then we're going to end with map charts because these can be really cool. They do have a little bit of a drawback. So we're going to talk through that and I'm going to show you some tricks when it comes to putting together a map chart as well. I'm also going to throw in some information about other types of chart because we have so many different chart types in Excel, but unfortunately we don't have time to cover them all today. So that is our agenda. So let's come out of here and I will load up the same spreadsheet that you guys hopefully have open. And we're going to start out on the chart types tab. So make sure that you're clicked on that because I just want to briefly talk about that point I mentioned that not all chart types are suitable for your data. And I've just got a little example here just to illustrate that. So we have a very small data set just here, and I mean very small. It's absolutely tiny. We have 4 different fruits, and we just have some prices for those fruits. And I've basically used this tiny data set and created 4 charts. And these are really 4 of the most popular charts that you see people using in their spreadsheets. So we have a pie chart, a column chart, a line chart, and a bar chart. And let's just take a moment to take a look at the different ways that these charts are displaying this data. Now, if we take a look at the 2 charts that are on the left-hand side, so for example, the pie chart and the line chart, these 2 really aren't great at displaying the data that we have. Now, pie charts, I'm not the biggest fan of pie charts. And the reason why is pretty well illustrated just here. If you have values in your data set that are reasonably close together, like I do here, there's not too much of a difference between any of these prices, it makes it quite hard to determine which is the highest price, which is the lowest price, just by looking at the pie chart. We could start adding things like data labels to make it really obvious, but it's particularly hard for me to tell which one is larger out of this yellow segment and the pink segment. They both look reasonably similar. Whereas if we have a look at the same data but displayed in a column chart on the right-hand side, we can instantly see which one of those has the highest price and which one has the lowest price. So the column chart on first glance is a lot easier to interpret than maybe the pie chart. Also, with a pie chart, if you have a lot more data points, so I only have 4 items I'm showing in here, but if I had like 20 things that I wanted to display in my chart, the pie chart segments start to get really small and your chart can get really confusing. And it's just not a great way to display larger data sets. So I'm going to explain to you a bit later on exactly what pie charts are good for, but for this type of data, not so great. The same thing with this line chart. If we take a look at this line chart is really showing me nothing. We've basically got our fruits running across the bottom. We've got the prices, and it's just showing me sort of that these prices go down depending on the fruits. Now, this isn't really telling me anything insightful at all. And that is because line charts are generally best for time-based data. So what I mean by that is if instead of item and price, I had the amount of fruit that sold between a specific period, so maybe January to December of 2022. Because I have a time element in my data, I could then use a line chart and it's going to display it a lot better. So line charts are better for time-based data that changes, okay? So again, this isn't really suitable for this type of data. Now, the other chart that we have here is the bar chart. And again, this would be suitable for this kind of data. A bar chart is basically just a flipped round version of the column chart. And you'll find that for a lot of your data sets that you're going to use, the column and the bar chart, they are good all-rounders. I always say, if in doubt, use a column or a bar chart. They do suit most types of data. Okay, so just be aware of that. The chart that you choose is really important when it comes to how effective you're communicating the message of your data. So just a few little tips and tricks there. So let's dive in and start to take a look at some examples. Now we're going to jump across to the Source tab because this contains the data that we're going to be putting into a chart. Now this data set, this is data from a store, I think. I just downloaded it off of the web. I think it's store sales data. It was a very large data set. It was about 7,000 rows. I've minimize this down to just 200 rows. So if I press Control down arrow, it's going to jump me to the last row. You can see we just have 200 rows of data that we're going to use in our charts. Now, another thing that I've also already done is I've put this data into a table. Now, how do I know that my data is in a table? Well, there's a couple of ways that I can tell. The main one and the easiest way to tell is if you take a look at your ribbons running across the top, notice that we have a table design contextual ribbon. If my data wasn't in a table, I wouldn't be able to see this ribbon up here. You can also see I have these filter drop downs. Those automatically get applied when we convert our data set into an Excel table. Now, if you're not sure how to convert data to a table, you simply click in it, press Control T. I can't do it because I'm already in a table, and it's going to just ask you if your data has headers. Click on OK, and it's going to format your data as a table. Now, what is the point of doing that? Why do we put our data into an Excel table before we analyze it? Well, the reason is most data sets aren't static. Most data sets will change over time. So I'm probably going to want to add more records into the bottom of this data set. Now, if I have my data in a table, one of the good things about tables is that they auto expand and will accommodate any new data that we add into the bottom. So consequently, if I've built a chart off of this table data, it's automatically going to include anything new that I add. I just need to refresh the chart. I don't need to sort of go in and start messing around with cell references. So my first tip is always put your data set into an Excel table before you put it into a chart, because it's going to be a lot easier for you when it comes time to update it. That moves me on to my next point, the difference between Excel tables and, Excel Excel charts, I should say, and pivot charts. Now, we can create an Excel chart off of any data set. So, for example, if I go back here, this small data set isn't in an Excel table. If I click in it, I'm not getting the table design ribbon, but I can still create a chart based off of this data set. So I can go to Insert. I have all of my chart options just here. I can open up and go to All Charts, and I can select any of these and create a chart. Whereas with a pivot chart, you need to create that based off of pivot table data. So your data needs to be in a pivot table first of all, in order for you to create a pivot chart. So you do have two slightly different chart types there, and we do use them in slightly different ways. Now, in this first example, we're going to build a clustered column chart off of pivot table data. So I'm going to take the data that I have here. It's already in a table. We're now going to create ourselves a pivot table. And we're going to put it over here on the Column Chart 1 tab. So because I have my data in a table, I can go up to Table Design, and we have a Summarize with Pivot Table option just here. So let's click it. I'm going to put my pivot table on an existing worksheet, and that existing worksheet is Column Chart 1, and I'm going to put it just here in cell B3. Let's click on OK. So now I have my empty pivot table. I'm going to build a very, very simple pivot table because we don't want to start cluttering up our charts too much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the market field, and I'm going to drop it down into rows. And then we're going to grab the sales field, and we're going to drop it into values. So what I'm looking at here is all of my data summarized by the market. So this is sort of like the region, and that's the total sum of sales for those particular markets. Now, before I create my pivot chart, I'm just going to do a little bit of formatting to this pivot table. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the number formatting so this looks a little bit better. So let's right click, number format, and I'm going to apply a counting format with 0 decimal places, like so. And I'm also going to remove the grand total because I don't want the grand total to be included in the chart when I create it. So let's jump up to the Design tab, go over to Grand Totals, and we're going to turn off for rows and columns. Lovely. So now my data is pretty much ready for me to create a pivot chart. So we're going to click in the data, up to Pivot Table Analyze. In the Tools group, we have Pivot Chart. So this is going to open your entire charts gallery. And this is what I mean. We have so many different chart types that we can choose from in here. And each of these chart types, each of these different categories also has numerous other variations of that particular chart. For example, in the line chart category, I could create a basic line chart, or I could create one that has markers. I can create a 3D line chart, so on and so forth. The donut chart, which is also a very popular chart that people like to use, is underneath pie. It's this one just here. It's basically a pie chart. It's just got a hole in the middle. Now, this leads me on to my first little tip here, and that is when you are creating charts of any kind, stay well away from the 3D version of anything. 3D charts are just really not great at allowing people to judge exactly what the values are represented in that chart. You can see this one, the perspective is all a bit off. It's very difficult to sort of be able to tell which segments are larger because of the perspective and the 3D element. So my advice to you, stay away from 3D charts. I'm sure there is a use for them in some industries, but in general, as a rule, stay away from them. As I mentioned before as well, with pie charts, I generally tend to like to stay away from pie charts, except if I have a very, very tiny data set. And when I say a tiny data set, I mean really comparisons between maybe 2 or 3 things. So for example, if I was analyzing a data set, maybe it was an HR data set, and I wanted to see how many male versus female people there were working at the company, I might use a pie chart for that because it's just 2 things that I'm comparing, male and female. And it's quite good for comparing 2 things together. It gives you a really good result. But anything more than that, I generally tend to stay away from pie and donut charts. Again, it's completely personal preference. That's just my feeling when it comes to pie charts. Use them with small amounts of data. Now, the chart that we're going to be creating is a column chart. And we're just going to start out with everyone's favorite, the good old clustered column chart. Let's select it, click on OK. Now, when you enter a chart, or a cluster column chart in this case, it's going to look like this. Now, it's displaying our data. It doesn't particularly look the best. It's not the most attractive thing in the world. We can definitely improve this by doing a little bit of formatting and tidying it up a little bit. Because what we're going to aim for is I want it to go from this, what we have on the screen, to something that looks like that. So this looks a lot better. It's also interactive. I can click on these little filters at the top here and the data changes depending on what I've selected. So this is a much more attractive looking chart than the one that we get when we first add it onto our spreadsheets. So lots of little tricks that we're going to use in order to recreate what we've just seen. Now, when you're looking at a chart or thinking about formatting a chart like this, the first thing you really need to think about is what data is absolutely necessary for people to know. People just want to be able to look at the chart and immediately be able to understand and interpret what it's displaying. So you want to try and make your chart as clean as possible. You want to remove from it anything that's not necessary to convey the message. So if I'm looking at this particular chart, the first thing that stands out to me is the legend. The legend, it just says total. I don't need it because I can already see the totals depicted in the chart. So this would be the first thing that I would get rid of. Now remember, with these different chart elements, they are just text boxes, so you can simply select them and press the delete key. Alternatively, you click the plus, go to legend, and you can just deselect legend to remove that from the chart. So that is the first thing that I would get rid of. The next thing I would probably remove from this chart are these grey buttons that you can see just here. Now, this one at the bottom acts as like a little filter. So if I wanted to filter specifically for different markets, I could use that. But in general, if I'm going to apply a filter to a chart, I'm probably more likely to filter on the pivot table as opposed to the actual chart. So I'm going to remove all of the grey buttons on here, again, to make this chart look a little bit cleaner. So we can right click and we can select hide all field buttons on chart, which is just simply going to get rid of those. So we're looking a little bit less cluttered now. What else do we want to do to this chart? Well, one thing I might want to do is I can see here, if I select all of the columns, these are representing the different markets. They're quite thin columns at the moment. Maybe I want these to be a bit chunkier, particularly if I'm going to add data labels where I have the actual value displayed within the bar. At the moment, this bar isn't wide enough to accommodate any of these sales values, so I'm going to make these a little bit wider. Now, when you're doing things like this, you have lots of chart formatting options. You have chart formatting options available on the ribbons. Notice we now have a pivot chart analyze ribbon, a design ribbon, and a format ribbon at the top. So loads of options for formatting our chart. We can also find additional options in the right-click menu. So I can right-click on any part of the chart and I get more options in here. And these are very contextual. So what you see in this right-click menu really depends on what part of the chart you're clicked on. So currently I'm clicked on the columns. If I was to click down here in the data labels and right-click, I get a different set of results. Okay, so you have formatting options in the right-click menu. And of course, you have your formatting pane as well. And we can bring that up by selecting whatever it is that we want to format, in this case, the columns, and pressing Control 1 to open Format Data Series on the right-hand side. So when we open Format Data Series, check out what we have here underneath Series Options. We have an option to adjust the gap width. Now, this is going to adjust the gap in between each of these bars. So effectively, I can make these skinnier, like so, or I can drag it down and I can make these bars a little bit fatter. So I like them quite chubby. Let's take them out like that. And again, as I said, if you're thinking of putting your actual data labels inside these bars, you want to make sure that they're wide enough to accommodate whatever values you have. So I think I'm going to leave mine like that. So now that we've done that, I'm going to go in and I'm going to add some data labels. Now we can right click and we can add data labels, and it's just going to add the actual values from the pivot tables on top of the bar. Now, the good thing about doing this is that once we add data labels in this way, it kind of means that we can get rid of this vertical axis running down the left-hand side. Because we have the values displayed on the chart, we don't really need this there. It's just another thing that's kind of unnecessary, taking up space. We can get rid of it. So let's press delete just to get rid of that. And now we just have our data labels. Now we can format these as well. So if we click on one data label, it's going to select them all. You can press Control 1 again to open your Format Data Labels pane on the right-hand side. And there's lots of things we can do in here. One of the more interesting things that we can do, if we go to Label Options, this is where we can specify what we're showing in our labels. So you don't necessarily have to show the value from our pivot table. We could show other things. Now, I have a very small data set, but if I was to choose, let's say, series name, for example, that's just going to say total. If I choose category name, it's actually going to put the market as well as the actual value. So sometimes that can be really useful depending on the data that you're displaying. Now, for me in this chart, that is overkill. I just want the value in there. And if we scroll down, we can change the label position. So currently I have these showing on the outside end of my bars, but I could choose to show them on the inside end. That can be quite a nice effect. And that's what I mean by having your bar wide enough to accommodate the actual value. We could put them inside the base. There's sometimes a bit of a problem with this because if you don't have a bar that's tall enough, it can look a little bit strange. Or you can put them on the outside end. That's always a reasonably safe option to put them just there. Now, something else that we can do here is maybe I decide that for these particular data labels, I don't necessarily need the currency formatting applied in here. I have it in the table, which is why it's been pulled through to the chart, but I could remove that by expanding number down here, and we can choose a different category of formatting. So if I format these as a number as opposed to a counting format, I can then take the decimal places down to 0 and I get a slightly cleaner looking number. So again, if space is a concern for you, you can do things like that, and it's not actually going to change it in the pivot table, it's just going to change it on the chart. Okay, so quite nice and useful. Now, another thing that you'll notice is that when you're putting together a pivot chart based off of pivot table data, notice that my pivot table data is organized alphabetically. So it's running from A to Z. So markets start with Africa, APAC, Canada, so on and so forth. And that's fine. It's displaying it in the chart in the same way, but it might be that you want to sort this. Instead of having it running A to Z, maybe you want it to run from largest to smallest, something like that. So this is where you would go to your pivot table. You can right click and you can sort largest to smallest, and it's going to change the way that that's ordered in your pivot chart as well. Okay, so don't forget about that. Sometimes it's a bit easier to read if you sort it in that way. So we're looking pretty good. It looks a lot cleaner to when we first started. There's still some other changes that we need to make. So let's start to talk about color. Now, when you create a chart, the default color that you see here is going to be based on whatever theme you have active in your Excel spreadsheet. So for most people, that might be the standard Office theme. If we go to page layout, this is where you can see what themes you have applied. Now, this is kind of the standard Office theme, which most people have by default. I've actually changed mine. I have my own custom theme. So that's what I'm using, but your colors might be slightly different. So if you want to change the colors of these bars, you can do it very simply. You can change the theme simply by selecting a different one from the gallery. Notice that it's also changing the font because these are themes. Themes contain colors, they contain fonts, and they contain effects. So you can use these. Alternatively, you can just click on the bars and go to the Format tab and use Shape Fill, and you can change them to whatever color you like. Okay. Now, a little trick here. It might be that you want to use a color in your chart that maybe is not part of the standard palette, it's not part of your theme colors. Maybe you have a very specific hex code that you need to use in your chart. If you work at a company, a lot of companies have branded colors that they like you to use across your documents, across your presentations, and across your spreadsheets. So you might have a very specific hexadecimal value, which relates to a color for your company's branded colors. Now I'm going to show you a little trick because I discovered this recently. I think it's been around in Windows for years, but I literally just found it the other day and I was like, oh, that's really cool. So I'm going to show you it now because this can be really useful. Because I don't know if you know, but if you are a PowerPoint user, you might be aware of the eyedropper utility. What the eyedropper utility allows us to do is basically use it to pick up a color anywhere in the PowerPoint slide and use it elsewhere. So that's brilliant if you're trying to match colors or you're trying to use branded colors. Maybe you're trying to match a color from a specific logo. You can literally click on it and transfer it to something else on the screen. Now, unfortunately, in Excel, if I was trying to do that, if I click on these bars and go to the Format tab, and Shape Fill, this is where you would find the eyedropper utility in PowerPoint in this little section down here. But notice we don't have one in Excel. So recently I discovered there is a way by utilizing a little Windows feature that can allow you to do exactly the same thing. So I'm going to show you this example because I think this is really helpful. Now, before we do this, I'm just going to insert a little logo that I downloaded. And this logo is not related at all to the data that we're using. But I just wanted, it was very colorful. So I thought it would be quite a good one to use. If I can remember where I put it, I think it was in downloads. There we go. So let's just say this is our company logo and it's over here. And I want to color the bars in my chart to match one of the colors in this logo. So everything looks cohesive and matches together. So this is where we can use a little feature in Windows called PowerToys to do this. Now, if you've never heard of PowerToys, it is something you have to install onto your PC. Now, I've got it loaded over here. Here it is. If you just Google PowerToys Microsoft, the first link that comes up is going to take you through to this website, and it's simply a case of clicking Install PowerToys. It's an official Windows thing, so you're not downloading anything nasty, and it's really cool. It allows you to do lots and lots of different things. It sort of extends the capabilities of your applications and of Windows, and one of the things you can do with it is you can utilize an eyedropper utility, which we can then use in Excel. So to bring up PowerToys, we need to press Alt Space. You can just search for PowerToys once you've installed it. and it will bring it up. It's this one just here. Now, as I said, there are lots of things you can do with Power Toys, lots of things. We're not going to get into any of these, but one of them is the color picker. Now, notice here the activation shortcut for color picker, Windows key Shift C. So if I know this shortcut, I don't even need to pull this up. I can just, in my Excel spreadsheet, press Windows Shift C, and it turns my cursor into a color picker. Take a look at that. And as I hover over colors in this logo, it's telling me what the hexadecimal value is. So if I have something very specific that I want to use, so maybe this orange color, I can just click. There's the hexadecimal value. I can then copy it to the clipboard, and I can then use it to color my chart bars. So I can then click on my chart bars, go to Format, Shape Fill, More Fill Colors, and this is where we can paste in that hexadecimal value. Okay, really cool. And you can see the last colors that you recently used are kept here as well. So that's a really nice little trick, because picking up branded colors can be a bit of a pain, particularly if you need to use a specific color in your chart. So that might be new for you. It might not. As I said, somebody told me the other day it's been around for 20 years. I only found out about it the other day, so I thought it'd be a good time to show you. So that's pretty good. Now, something else we can do here when it comes to selecting different elements in your chart. For example, maybe I want to remove the grid lines. I can click on the grid lines. Sometimes it's quite hard to select specifically what you want. Now, what can help you to do this is if you jump up to the, I think it's the, where are we? The Format tab just here. In the current selection group, this allows us to select specific areas of the chart. So if I want to delete those grid lines, instead of fiddling around with my cursor trying to select them, I can just choose grid lines. It's going to select them all, press the delete key to get rid of them. Okay, so this little drop down is good for selecting different parts of your chart. A couple of other things I might want to do here. I'm going to add a quick title to my chart. So this is a simple case of just typing in the the text box. So let's say total sales by market. You could add another text box if you want to have a subtitle under here. I'm not going to do that because I feel like we're running out of time a little bit here. We're just going to add the one title. But one thing we are going to do is we're going to add a slicer to our chart. And again, slicers are brilliant things to add to your chart. If you're not sure what they are, if we take a look at this one, this is the slicer. It's a filter which we can use if we want to see all of the markets where we're just looking at furniture sales for all of the different markets, or just looking at office supplies for all of the different markets. So it's a visual filter which is useful for people, and it's easy for people to understand. Now, a couple of tricks when it comes to inserting slicers and formatting them. If we click on our chart, go up to Pivot Chart Analyze, in the filter group, we can choose Insert Slicer. And what you're going to see here is a big long list of all of the fields from your original data set. So we can insert a slicer for any of these fields that we have in our data set. So I'm going to choose category. We're just going to have the one slicer. You can have as many as you like to insert that. Now, when you insert a slicer, they have a very sort of generic standard look and feel to them. And if I was just to leave this as it is, I mean, it works. It's going to work on my data. It's going to filter, but it doesn't really look cohesive. It doesn't look like it's part of this chart at all. And again, we want to try and make everything look really engaging and like it's meant to be there. So what we can do here is apply some formatting to make this look a little bit better. Now notice when I'm clicked on the slicer, we have a slicer contextual ribbon. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is, instead of displaying these categories running vertically, I want to display them horizontally. Now we can change that by using, in this buttons group, where we have columns, currently it says one column. I can take this up to 3 columns, which will effectively allow me to display these categories running horizontally. I'm just going to expand them out, and let's move that up to resize it. So immediately that's looking a little bit neater. Another thing I might want to do is maybe remove this header information just here. So where we have category and then these buttons, maybe I don't want to display that. We can right click, we can go into our slicer settings. And notice here underneath header, currently display header is ticked. We can deselect it, click on OK, and it gets rid of that header. So we now have a much cleaner looking slicer. The last thing I would probably do here is I would create a custom style for my slicer so that it matches everything that I have in my chart. Now, when it comes to changing the colors of your slicer, we have a gallery of slicer styles. We have some dark styles and we have some light styles. And again, what you see in here are very much based on your theme colors. Now, I change my bars to match the color picked out of the logo. So none of these slicer styles are really going to work well. None of them are very similar to this orange color. So what I would probably do here is create a new slicer style, a custom slicer style, and use this orange color in the slicer. Now, it's very simple to create a slicer style. You just need to select the one that you're currently using. So you can see the slicer style that's currently in use because it has a border around the outside. So it's this one. Right click and you need to duplicate the style. You can then give your new slicer style a name. So I always call them my initials. Slicer, I've done a few of these, so I'm going to name this Slicer 3. And then you can go through and customize each part of that particular slicer. So one of the first things I'd probably want to do here is I don't really want that border around the outside of the slicer. So if I go to Whole Slicer and Format, I can then remove the border or set the border to none to get rid of that border around the outside. If I wanted to change the colors, I could then go into any of these and make them this orange color. Now, there's lots of different items related to these because you can have a different color if the item's selected and has data. You can have a different color if you just hover over it, a different color if it's unselected. So there's lots of different things you can change in here, but it's basically the same principle. You select what you want to change, you go into Format. If you want to change the background fill color, you could do that. You can go to more colors, you can add your hexadecimal value, you can change the font color, you can do whatever you like. Now, just to save a bit of time, I've already got a slicer style or a custom slicer style, which I set up earlier. I basically just went through this process and changed things to the orange color. So if I cancel out of here, once you've created your slicer style, you're going to see it up here in the custom area. And you can simply select it and then you'll have your new slicer style applied and it looks a lot more cohesive with the rest of this chart. If I click away, you can also see that we have no border around the outside. So when I remove the grid lines from Excel, you can see it looks like it's supposed to be part of this chart. I also might want to remove the border around the outside here. So I'm going to select the chart, go to Format, Shape Outline, and we're going to say no outline. And then you can move the slicer so it's a bit closer to it. And we have a really nice looking cohesive chart. Okay, so a few different tips and tricks just there. How are we doing for time? About 10 past, not too bad. Let's move on to our next chart. Now, I spoke quite a bit about line charts. If I just go to the second line chart that we have here, this is a reasonably interesting chart. Again, we're using a slicer, but a different type of slicer. This is a timeline slicer that we have at the top. And then what I've done here is I've combined two chart types together to get this kind of look and feel. So what we're going to do is we're basically going to recreate this so you can see a few other techniques. So let's go back to our data set. So this time I'm displaying time-based data because, as we know, when we're using a line chart, it works best for data that changes over time. So I have some months of the year and I have the sum of sales. So let's go in, let's insert a chart. And this time we're going to insert just a line chart. I'm going to do a lot of the same formatting. Again, I don't really need the total. That's kind of irrelevant in this case. So I'm going to delete that. And I'm also going to hide all the field buttons on the chart. Now, let's take a look at the data. So if you notice, the chart doesn't have all of the months. We have some gaps. So we have January, February, March, April, and then we skip over May. So there's obviously no data for May, June, July, August, September, but then we don't have October, November, and December. Because my chart is just going to show where we have data. So if I didn't have any sales in May, it's just not going to show it. Now, it might be that you're happy with it like that, but a much better way is to include all of the months, but just have it at 0 where there were no sales. So how can we change this to include any of these months? Well, what we can do is if we right click and go into, I think we go into value field, sorry, not value field settings. Right click on the date and go into field settings. And we're going to go to layout and print. And we want to select this option here, show items with no data. When I click on this, it's going to show the items that don't have any data. And these little weird dates just here, don't worry about those. That's because I deleted a whole heap of data from the data set first of all. So I'm just going to remove those. Just pretend they're not there. But notice that we now have all of the dates or all of the months showing in the chart, but there's just no data. Now, this looks a bit weird because we have a broken line chart. I don't really want it to look like that, but I do want it to include all of the months. Now, it doesn't matter because what we can do is we just need to add a 0 in for all of these months to get that line to run correctly. So again, a quick way of doing this is if we right click, we can go into pivot table options, and we can say in this format group for empty cells show, instead of nothing, we want to show a 0. And that's basically going to join that line back up, but it's not going to be a broken line. It just goes down to 0 when there haven't been any sales. All right, so just think about that when you're working through your chart as well. A couple of other little things. Let's take a look at this little vertical axis just here. Now, this looks pretty good. Now, sometimes if you have an axis like this and it's displaying values, it might be that your values are very, very long. If this was millions of sales, so if we had very, very large numbers here is what I'm trying to say, this can start to look a bit strange because your axis just has a very, very large number in here. So this might be where you want to start thinking about using custom formatting just to shorten the values that you're seeing. For example, I can see here, I've got, these are in thousands. We've got 2,000, 4,000, 6,000. Maybe instead of this longer number, I just want it to say 2K, 4K, 6K, 8K, things like that. I can do that using custom formatting. So if we click in the vertical axes, Control 1 to pull up format axes, and go all the way down to the bottom where we have number, this is where we can start to change the formatting. So if we go to custom, notice here underneath type, this is what you want to type in to format these numbers with K after them. Okay, so I already typed the code in. Once you've applied one code to your data, it will be available for you to select from this drop down. So I did this earlier, so it's selected just here. You would type it into here and click add to get it to appear in the menu above. So this is the format that you need if you want to change that to 2K, 4K, so on and so forth. All right, so think about using custom formatting to shorten the numbers that you're using in your chart. Another thing you might want to do here is you might want to reorder the way that your chart's displaying these months. So currently my chart is showing the data from January to December. But what if I'm an accountant and I want to see this data based off of the financial year? So maybe I want to have the chart starting at April and going all the way through to March. A quick way of reordering everything is if you go to the pivot table, if I want to move April up to the top, I can simply select it, click, and just drag it up to the top, and it's going to rearrange it. So I could select multiple. So April, I want to move all of these. I can drag them, up And I now have my chart based off of the financial year as opposed to the actual calendar year. So again, another little trick, you can drag and drop to move things around. What else can we do with our line charts? Let's do some fun formatting. Let's select the line. Again, Control 1 to open up Format Data Series. A couple of little cool things that we can do in here. If we jump across to Marker and expand Fill, this is where we can change the fill color of the specific markers on the line. But one little option that I quite like, because this is quite a fun little option, is this one just here, Vary Colors by Point. If you want to quickly add some color to your chart, if you click that, it's basically going to make each change in point a different color. So again, makes it look a little bit more interesting. So maybe think about doing something along those lines. Again, if we select the line and go back to Marker, if we don't want that, we can just choose a solid fill color. So maybe instead of Vary Colors by Point, let's go for a pink line. Sorry, I meant to change the marker. Let's go to the markers option at the top, and I'm going to go to built-in, and I'm going to choose one of these markers. So underneath built-in, instead of just having a round marker, you can choose any of these symbols. And if you choose one of these built-in marker options, if I go for this one, you can then choose the size as well. So I could have this really large if I wanted to, or I could take this down, but I can make them more prominent so they stand out. Now I've filled the marker color with this pink. We also have a border around the outside. I'm just going to do that in the same pink. And then if I want to change the color of the line, of course I can click on the line, go to the line section, and we can change the solid line color to whatever we like just here. So have I just selected one again? I'm not very good at selecting, as you can probably tell. Let's change it to solid line, and I want all of them to be pink along those lines. So you can really sort of start to change things, jazz it up, make it look less boring. Another really interesting option, and something that I'm seeing fairly frequently, is instead of having an angled line, I've seen people using a smooth line quite a bit. So if you click on the line and scroll all the way down to the bottom, notice we have smooth line just here. If I click this, instead of an angled line, we kind of get that curvy line instead. Okay. And just quickly, because we're running out of time and I haven't showed you a lot of the things that I want to show you, but just very quickly, if you wanted to get sort of a different effect where you have your line, but then you have the area underneath the line chart is shaded, you can combine this with an area chart. Now, in order to do this, you can't really have a smooth line. So I'm just going to deselect smooth line, because what we would need to do here is add another series into our chart. So what I'm going to do is we're going to click in the pivot table. We're going to open up the field list, and I'm just going to add another sales field into the values area. So this is basically exactly the same as the other one. Let's format it so that it looks the same. And I think I just had number formatting for this with 0 decimal places. So now what we can do is we can bring this series into the chart. So I can right click. Hang on, do I want to do that? Just bear with me 1 second. I thought that was going to bring it into the chart automatically, but it hasn't. Just bear with me. I was expecting that to automatically add, but it didn't. I'm going to come back to that at the end because I want to make sure that we get some of the content. What we're basically going to do is just create another series and change it to an area chart, but it's not doing what it did earlier. Maybe I've done something a little bit wrong there. We'll come back to that at the end. Let's move on to our next chart because we've only got about 10 minutes left. This one is a stacked column chart, and this is a really cool little technique if you want to add formulas into your charts and also add a target line as well. Now, here we have a slightly different setup. So I've got some companies A to E. I have some sales figures for those companies, and we have a sales target up here. So basically what I want to do is I want this kind of effect. So what we have is a target line. So whenever the sales target changes, if I change this to 18,000 up here, the target line moves, and notice that those bars are conditionally formatted so that if they fall below the sales target, they show in green. If they fall above, they show in pink. And this is actually a really easy effect to achieve. We just need a couple of formulas and to add a few things into the chart. So let's go back to here and see how we set this up. Now, anything that you want to include in a chart, you need to make sure that you kind of add it into your table over here. So what I need is I need to have a heading that says target met. I'm going to have another one that says target not met. And I'm also going to pull the sales target into this little table as well. Let's format these. Let's make them gray and just resize these columns. Now, this is going to seem a little bit weird, but even though I don't have any data in here yet, I'm going to create the chart first of all. So I'm going to press Control A to select everything. Let's go up to Insert, and this time we're just going to create a regular chart. It's not a pivot chart or anything like that. We're going to add just a clustered column, a stacked column chart. So what we have here is the only data series that we have showing are the actual sales, because that's all we have in our table at the moment. But notice in the legend, we have a key for target met, target not met, and sales target, but we don't have any data for that as yet. So as we add data, because this is a stacked column chart, you're going to see this data pile up on top of each of the columns. Now, what we want to do here is we want to use formulas in this particular chart. So we're going to use an if formula to find out if the sales value has met the target or not. So let's type in equals if a logical test. So if the sales value is greater than or equal to our sales target, and we're going to press F4 to lock because we want to copy this down. If that's true, we want to output the sales value. If it's false, I want a blank cell. So now when I close this off and copy it down, what we should find is that whenever the sales value has met or exceeded the sales target, we have the value in the cell. Whenever it hasn't, we have a blank. And I'm just going to apply comma formatting to make everything look the same. So we're going to do a similar thing over here. We're going to say if, and we're going to do another logical test, but this time we're going to test if it's under the sales target. So if the value is less than the sales target, F4 to make it absolute because we're going to copy down. If that's true, we want to output the value into the cell. If it's false, we want a blank. Close the bracket, hit enter. And this time when we copy it down, we should find we have those other values showing. So let's add some formatting. And notice as I'm doing this, it's stacking that information onto the chart. The final thing I want to add into here is the actual sales target. So all I'm going to do is link to the sales target cell. Let's press F4 and copy this down. Now you might be thinking, what on earth are you doing? We're going to make some changes now to make this chart look a little bit better. So I don't want my chart to display like this, but I have all the information that I need. So I need to make some changes as to how we're representing these different values. Now, the first thing here is these sales values, which is represented by the green part of this column, we don't really need those because we have those in these two columns just here. Our formulas are generating these values. So if I click on the chart, you can see here it's showing me the columns that are in use in the chart. We can grab the bottom handle and we can drag in to exclude those sales figures, and it's going to use the target met and the target not met values instead. The next thing we want to do is we want to change the sales target. We don't want that showing as part of the column. We want that to show as a line. So this is where we can right click and we can change the chart type. Click on the bars and change series chart type. At the bottom here, this is where we can define what type of chart we're using for each of our data series. So I want all of these to show as a column, but I don't want sales target to show as a stacked column chart. I want it to show as a line chart instead. And notice as soon as I change that, we get the effect that we're looking for. Click on OK, and we now have a target line, which hopefully will move when we change the sales target value in cell C2, which it does. Notice that those bars change color as soon as I start adding values in. Okay, so a really cool little effect. We can then go in and of course we can start formatting the line however we want. We can change the color, we can add arrows on the end, we can do whatever we like with this particular line. And that's all I've done over here is I've pretty much removed the grid lines. I've moved the legend up to the top and I've just added some arrows on either side of that target line. So that can be a really nice little effect and a really cool way to make your charts a little bit more dynamic. Final few minutes because it's 25 past. I knew we would struggle. I just want to talk to you briefly about map charts because map charts can look really cool. I always see them used in dashboards. And as you would imagine, the best type of data to use a map chart on is geographical data. Now, I want to show you a little problem that does occur with map charts. And the data set that we're going to use is we've got some states listed just here, and I'm actually just going to delete out that bottom one. I've got some states listed here, and these are states in Australia. Okay, and we'll just say that this is for a store and how much revenue they've generated by each state. So if I wanted to depict this in a map chart, I could click in the data, jump up to insert. In maps, I could go for filled map. Now, these can be a little bit slow to load, but when they do, this isn't going to display as I want it to display. And again, you might need to wait a couple of seconds for it to actually load up. There we go. The data that I've selected is just for Australia, but it's showing me the entire world. Now, why is it showing me a world map instead of just Australia? Well, it's because in my little table where I have the state WA, can you see, if you zoom in on America, you can see that I think it's Washington State, that would make sense, is showing in a light green color. It's very hard to see, but that's because the map chart thinks that where I have WA in the pivot table, I'm talking about Washington State as opposed to Western Australia. So it's showing me the whole map because it thinks I've included data or US-based data as well as Australian data. So a way to get around this is you need to make sure you add the country in as well as the state. So if you're listing out states of America or states of India or provinces of Canada or counties of the UK, make sure that you add the country as well. So if I delete this out, as soon as I add another column, Control-Shift+ is the shortcut key to add a brand new column. I'm going to type in country. Let's just make that bold. And if we add in Australia, a quick way to copy this down is just to select all of the cells, Control-D to copy down. And now if I do the same thing and insert a filled map chart, it's just going to zoom in on Australia. Okay, I'm not going to get that whole map because it knows I'm talking about Australia and not the US. So just bear that in mind when you're creating map charts. Another thing I would always advise you do is that you put your data into a table, because notice that currently this state just here, which is Queensland, is in grey, and I haven't included that in my data set. If I was to add this onto the bottom, so if I put Australia, QLD and 20,000, it doesn't update. I would need to put this data into a table, Control-T, because then when I add a new line on the bottom, it is then going to update in the map chart. Okay, so put your data in a table. Now, the final point before I let you go about these field map charts, you cannot create a field map chart based on pivot table data. Let me show you what I mean. Let's pretend that this is a pivot table as opposed to just an Excel table. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to convert this. I'm just going to summarize with pivot table. Let's put it on an existing worksheet. Let's put it down here. We're going to add country to the rows, state, and revenue, basically trying to get it to look like the table above. And we're going to change the report layout to tabular form. Now, what I would need to do is I'm going to need to remove the grand totals and the subtotals, and I want to have Australia copied all the way down. So we can do this by right-clicking and going into pivot table options, and we can say, where are we? I can never remember. Oh, sorry, no, it's under report layout, repeat all item labels. So this is a pivot table. But if I try and create a map chart based off of pivot table data, so if we go to pivot table analyze and pivot chart, and we have map in here, notice we get an error. It says you can't create this chart type with data inside a pivot table. So if you're trying to do this, what you need to do is basically take the data out of the table first of all. So if you've got pivot table data, you want to Control-C to copy it, and then you want to just paste it as plain text. So basically, so it looks like this up here, okay? Then create your map chart based off of that new data, and you can always right-click and choose Select Data, and then point it back to the pivot table afterwards. Okay, so the point being here is you cannot create a map chart based off of pivot table data. It needs to be just table data, or you can copy and paste and then redirect back to the pivot table afterwards. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you all enjoyed that. I hope you all learn at least one thing that you think is going to help you. Have a great night, a great afternoon, a great morning, wherever you are, and I will see you next time. Bye, guys.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To see the full course that this video came from, click over there. And click over there to see more videos from Simon Says It.